Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Care Connect session. Um, Seems as though we just have one individual on the call right now, Melissa. So if you want to take off your camera and show your smiling face, by all means, go right ahead. But if you just want to sit and listen, that's fine as well. But again, welcome and thank you for joining our session. Let me just do a screen share before we get into the presentation. Just want to introduce some of our team members at the CARE office. So Myrna Gran is our executive director, and she's not on the call today. We got Jordan Sisawa, who is on our call today. He's our marketing and industry relations manager. And we have Diana Svensson on our call today as well, our office administrator coordinator. My name is Lisa Saragusa, and I take care of all the member relations as well as training needs here at CARE. Tracy Shelton is our communications as well as our convention manager. Erin Krimble is our accountant. And Juliana Gran helps us and takes care of our database and our CRM to make sure that all of our information is up to date so that when we do send out relevant information about our industry, that everybody who needs to get it does indeed get it. You can see on our screen as well is a list of all of our board of directors. So please, if you have any questions about CARE, who we are, what we do, where we're going, or any comments, questions, please reach out to any of the staff members and or board members, and we'd be happy to help you and answer your questions. And speaking about reaching out to us, this is our contact information. So there's our address, our phone number, email address, and as well, there is all the social media channels that we are on. So please engage with us, like and share our posts, and share them as well, and make sure that you engage. And if you are on the call today and you are not a member of CARE, we are only as strong as our membership, and the more that we can have on our team, the better that we can be as an ag industry. So there's a QR code that will take you to our membership page with some details. But again, if you do have any questions specific around membership, do not hesitate to reach out to me directly. And the reason for us being here today is for our Care Connect sessions. These are sessions that we actually began doing last February, and we've received some great topics of information that are relevant to our industry. And recently we've been doing some sessions with AAFC, which we will be doing again today. If you do want to see a lineup of all of our Care Connect sessions that we are hosting up until the end of April, then we will take a bit of a break because it's a busy time for some of our members, but we will come back in the fall. So our fall lineup is not set as of yet. So if you do have any ideas of some topics that you would like us to have during these Care Connect sessions, again, please reach out to any one of our members. Let us know what that is. I will also be sending out a post-session survey where you can indicate some of your ideas there as well. And next week, we do have another session from an AAFC member who will be talking about some more research that is going on in the industry as well. But for today, let's continue on and talk about what's happening today. We have Michelle Hubbard, and I hope I pronounced that right. I forgot to ask you. Thank you. Who has worked as a research scientist specializing in disease and pulse crops at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Swift Current. She's been there since 2017. Her research focuses on root rot in pea and lentil. Oh goodness, I'm not sure that next word. Anthracose, sorry. Of lentils, as well as, I don't know that word either. I should have asked you before I began. My apologies. But maybe you can enlighten us once I finish reading your bio. So you are interested in intercropping as an innovative and sustainable cropping practice and better understanding the impacts of intercropping of disease, weeds, yields, and other important agronomic factors. And again, I apologize. I should have asked you prior to reading your bio about some of those words. But why don't you take it from here, Michelle, and let us know what you've been doing some research on.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I hope everyone can hear me all right.
Absolutely, go right ahead.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope it doesn't look like it's shared. Try again. All right, do you see the screen in presenter mode?
Everything, absolutely. Everything's looking great. Thank you.
All right, good. So I can sort of restate my bio to catch what was missed. So as you said, I work as a pulse pathologist. So I specialize in diseases of pulse crops, and some of those hard to pronounce or funny ones were probably anthracnose, which is a foliar disease of lentil, and then ascochyta blight. Anthracnose won't come up again in this presentation, but ascochyta blight will, and is also in one of the questions in the multiple choice if you're looking to get credits for this talk. So you can pay attention to that. Ascochyta blight caused in chickpea by the fungus Ascochyta rabii, and that will appear on a future slide. So anyway, today I'm here to talk about intercropping, which is a topic that I'm very excited about, as it's a innovative and potentially cost-saving and input-saving method. So first off, what is intercropping? And let's see if my slides will advance. There we go. So what is intercropping? Basically, it's growing two or more, it could be more than two, crops together in the same field. And there's lots of different iterations of intercropping or things that could be considered intercropping. Like there is relay cropping where you could be planting one crop first and another crop later. And that would still be considered intercropping if there's some overlap in time and space. Um, but the examples that I'm going to touch on today, the idea is seeding them at the same time and harvesting them at the same time. And then examples of intercrops that are grown in Saskatchewan include chickpea flax, which is one I've done quite a bit of work on and will feature in this presentation as it's one of the better studied ones. Pea canola or pea with other brassicas like mustard is also a common one. Pea oat, lentil and flax, lentil and camelina, lentil and wheat are all examples that I've seen in Saskatchewan. And so I have here a few pictures with the pea canola near the end of the season, pea oat from a paper that I'll talk about a little bit in a little while, and then chickpea flax, where nearer the end of the season, where you can see the flax is taller than the chickpea, and then the seed that's been cleaned of debris, but there's still chickpea and flax seed together in someone's hand. And then just a few more examples. So lentil and flax at a commercial scale, and then camelina and lentil. And this second picture was just from this past summer out at Indian Head at AFC site with a study led by Bill May there. And so why would you want to intercrop? This is what's important for farmers or for those who advise them to consider. If you're thinking about it, you want to have one or more particular reasons to do it, not just for fun. So it increases diversity, obviously, and that could be a benefit in and of itself. It can decrease risk. So, for example, if one crop is wiped out due to a pest or a disease, or conditions, the other one, or a bad seed lot, or anything really, the other might fill the gap. So, for example, if you had pea and canola and there was terrible root rot and the peas all died, instead of having a crop failure, you could still have a canola yield. And then you might want to try intercropping to address one or more, sometimes interrelated agronomic problems. So the one, of course, that's always top of mind for me is disease. So you might want to use intercropping as a way to reduce disease or reduce the number of fungicides that you need, or that makes sense financially and hence save yourself some money. And I've heard that quite a bit at farmer and agronomist meetings that it makes sense to do it as a way of reducing inputs or reducing risk and increasing profitability. But of course, it has to work for you. Then there could be other reasons like weed management or reducing lodging. I'll I have a few slides about those too in a minute. It could also help with maturity timing, which is one of the reasons we've been focused on chickpea flax. So chickpea being an indeterminate crop or a crop that can just stay green into the end of the season if it's wet, flax can help with that. And by doing that, it can reduce the amount of breed seed. And so as a farmer or an advisor, this could be important if you're kind of on the edge of a normal chickpea growing region, like somewhere like Indian Head or Red Vers, farther to in the east of Saskatchewan where it's wetter, or a little farther north. Um, it can make sense to diversify your rotations that way by including chickpea, which doesn't get the typical root rot that you get for pea and lentils. And so you could increase your options that way. And it could also be a source of reduce the amount of nitrogen fertility that you need, or the nitrogen drawdown by the legume crop providing nitrogen to the non-legume in that situation. So now to touch on a little bit more of disease, and here's where I promised that Ascochyta word is spelled out, the fungus is spelled out, Ascochyta rabii. And there's a couple of pictures of the typical symptoms of this disease on a chickpea pod or a stem, where we have those concentric circles with little black dots, the black dots being the pycnidia, or the place where the spores form on the chickpea. And so intercropping can work to reduce disease, and there's possible ways in which this can work, one of which is as a barrier to disease spread. So for a disease like Ascochyta in chickpea, but also Ascochyta in other crops, it's a disease that can be spread many times throughout the growing season on rain splash or with wind. And so having another crop that's not susceptible and might be taller, then that can be just be a physical barrier and stop that spread. It can also be a dilution effect, so there's just fewer, less dense, and less contact between the susceptible hosts, and that can reduce spread. It can also change the growth of the crops, so change height or branching, for example, and that could reduce the susceptibility, or reduce lodging. And then if your crops are not laying on the ground, not only are they easier to harvest, they're also not all wet, and so less likely to become a source of disease. And potentially intercropping could change the microclimate, so create a drier climate in the canopy, and which is less likely for disease to develop, because disease really likes those wet conditions so that the spores can germinate. And potentially by increasing the plant defenses if the presence of an intercrop stimulates defense in the crop with the disease you're trying to manage. And then weeds. So the theory here is that in an intercrop situation, there could be better utilization of the resources or the niches that weeds could otherwise take up, and so there are fewer weeds. And or for crops that are not as competitive, like pulses, then having another more competitive crop in the mix could just suppress weeds by outcompeting them. And however, you need to be aware that any herbicides you want to use, you have to make sure that they're compatible with both or all crops in the intercrop. So this graph here is an example of weed management from that paper about pea and oats, where I showed the photograph earlier. And so the work here happened in 2019 and 2020 around Saskatchewan. I've tried to pick examples here that are either from my own work or work of other people that I know that's done in Saskatchewan to make it more applicable directly to farmers or agronomists here in Saskatchewan or in the prairies. So in this case, what's really going on is that in a lot of the sites, like SURF is a site name or WCA is a site name, those are different sites and years. And so in a lot of sites here, 3 of the 4 that this graph is showing, there really weren't a lot of weeds, hence the short graphs. And then in the one year in SURF, which is a site in Red Vers in southeast Saskatchewan, that's run by my colleague Lana Shaw, there they did actually see substantial weeds. And so taller bars here indicate more weed biomass. Um, then, um, sorry, somebody was at my door. And they um, found that there was a substantial amount of weeds in 2020 and found that the in the white bar, which is the peas by themselves, um, then then yeah, that do I have that right? Then the um, weeds were suppressed by the intercrop relative to some of the monocrops. And then in this same paper, they also found lodging benefits. So there was not a lot of lodging in oat by itself, the oat monocrop. And then in the pea monocrop, there was quite a lot of lodging, up to 40% or so. And then, um, or 30% in the pea monocrop um, that was hand weeded. And then as the percentage of oat increased, that provided structural support. And so then that reduced the lodging. And by lodging, of course, I mean the plants falling over and laying on the ground, which can be a problem for peas. And then another big reason why farmers might want to consider intercropping is yield benefits, because of course that's really what you're after. And a way that we look at this is, of course, you can look at the yield of each individual crop, but then you can also look at what we call land equivalency ratio, or LER. And that's calculated by considering um, how much so in a small plot setting, like where we have controls, we'll have a monocrop of, say, chickpea and of flax by itself, and then we'll have the two combined. If you're a farmer, you'd have to sort of imagine that or think of your test strips or your nearby fields and say, what is the yield when you have chickpea by itself? And then what's the yield when you have flax by itself over that, like per acre or per meter squared, and then compare that to what you get in an intercrop. And often, but not always, you'll find that the yield of each individual partner goes down, which makes logical sense because perhaps the seeding rate was lowered, though not always, and perhaps there's competition with the other companion crops. But even that's not always the case. But even if it is, say the chickpea yield was decreased to 80% of the monocrop, and then the flax yield was decreased to 50% of the monocrop. If you add that 80% and 50%, that's 130%. So then you'd have or 0.8 plus 0.5 is 1.3. So you'd have a ratio that's greater than 1. And so if we see a LER or a land equivalency ratio more than 1, you're coming out ahead. And so that's often an important consideration. And then other considerations, these are more not benefits and not necessarily downsides. Sometimes they're downsides, but more often they're just things that you should think about before you jump into doing an intercrop or when you're in the planning stages, like selecting what you want to grow and where you want to grow it. They're what you should think about as a farmer or an advisor, or if you're an advisor, be prepared to bring these up with your clients so that they're aware of like what are some of the things you need to consider. So I have this slide that lists considerations kind of generally, and then for some of these considerations, I have follow-up slides to illustrate in a little more detail what I mean. So generally you want to consider, are you going to insure this through crop insurance? How many acres or how much you're going to plant? How does it fit in with your past and future crop rotations? Where will you put these? Where will you put your intercrop? And how will you seed it? That's a big one that I'll come back to. Fertility, so will you add fertilizer or not? Because the two crops might have different recommendations. How will you manage weeds? And so, as I showed in a previous slide, there can be weed control benefits, but not always. And then the weed control benefits tend to show up more when there is high weed pressure, but it could limit your herbicide options, of course. For example, if it's a grassy and a broadleaf companion, especially, then you might limit what herbicides you have. And then the same goes for fungicides, that while it has disease control benefits for some diseases, you have to pick fungicides that are registered for both crops. And there could be insect management benefits for the same similar kind of reasons as disease, like just it dilutes or reduces the availability to the insect if the insect is specific to one of the crops. And then you really have to think about, will the crops mature at the same time? How will you harvest them? How will you separate the seeds? And will you store the seeds before or after you separate them? So for crop insurance, there are a few options and there's um, uh, recorded presentations and information on the crop insurance website to learn more about this. But there are options to insure intercrops so long as they're not your entire farm. Or there's, of course, the option of not insuring, and that is done by 30 to 70% of acres that are reported. So people can report their acres to crop insurance, which as a researcher, I love that. And as crop insurance, to get better crop insurance in the future, that's important. So the table I show here shows the acres that are insured under this diversification and intercrop rainfall programs. But then there's also a larger number of acres, sometimes it's larger, sometimes smaller, number of acres that were not insured. And then I would suggest that you start small if you're new to intercropping just because of the logistics. Not because it's a bad idea, but just to figure out how to do things. And that you talk to people who have experience, such as agronomists or farmers who've tried it or who would know something about it. And then consider rotations. And this can be complicated, for example, in the example that I'll come back to later about pea and brassica, that pea, of course, is now in your rotation, as is canola. So you want to have disease breaks. So you shouldn't be putting that on pea stubble or canola stubble if it's pea canola, and that can complicate your rotation. You also want to be aware of volunteers and weed control. This picture is an example of putting chickpea and flax on canola stubble, and so it turned into a three-way intercrop that was not what was wanted in that situation. Um, and so just things to consider. And it might make it complicated if all you were doing was intercropping. If you were just putting an intercrop in on occasion, for example, the chickpea flax, we've generally put that on a cereal stubble, and that's been fine. But if you were then to continue intercropping, it complicates things. It doesn't make it impossible, it just means something that you need to think about. Then for seeding, there's a lot to think about there. So timing, of course, when is it reasonable for both crops? And then depth, will you seed both if you often want to have different sizes in intercropping because that makes seed separation so much easier. If, for example, chickpea and flax, there's flax seeds are small, chickpeas are large, and that gives you an obvious way to separate the seeds. But in general, of course, larger seeded crops want to go deeper and smaller, shallower. So do you pick like a compromise depth? And if so, how do you accomplish that? And based on moisture, if there's more moisture, maybe you can get away with shallower. How will that affect emergence? And consider that in your seeding rates. Or another option that's sometimes employed is putting the larger seed deeper by using the side bander. So pretending that it was a fertilizer. And then how will you arrange the rows? It can be done either in mixed rows, which means having the two crops together in the same row, or in alternating rows. So say a row of chickpea and a row of flax, and then another row of chickpea, another row of flax. Or it could be in strips, or like strips of 2 rows of one and 1 row of the other. And then seeding rates is another really big consideration. One common strategy is, say, just cutting both things to 50%. So, but what we've done in my research for the chickpea flax is we've actually kept the chickpea rate high, like the same as one would use in a monocrop, and then reduced the flax rate. or you can do different ratios. So it's something to really think about based on what do you expect for emergence and what are your goals, like being aware that that will, of course, as you increase a seeding rate of one crop, then the abundance or the density of that crop is going to go up. And so that might be what you want or it might not, depending on your goals. And then how are you going to handle fertility, especially nitrogen, if a pulse crop is involved? Will you reduce the nitrogen rate? Will you kind of compromise? Will you give um, the non-pulse just its normal fertilizer rate? Any of those things could be done. More often I've seen reduced or eliminated nitrogen fertility, but that's not the only way to go. It's something to think about and something that more testing and more research is really needed. And then how will you harvest? Will you harvest both crops together? And what will the settings on your combine be so that you can do this? Some combinations can work nicely, like chickpea and flax can work together because the larger chickpea seeds can break up the flax bolls and make the flax seed more available. And then will you end up with something like the picture on the top there of that bag where you have a lot of, because you've turned down the air, say in your combine really low to avoid blowing out the small seeds, will you then end up with a lot of chaff and residue that you have to deal with? Um, so things to think about. And then how will you separate the seed? Will you hire a specialty seed cleaner? Will you do it yourself? A common way of doing it is by size, as I mentioned, but you could also use shape or optical sorting. There's other methods, so just something to think about. And then if you don't separate immediately, will you store the seeds together? And that will have implications for moisture and avoiding seed spoilage. Um, for example, you might want to do that if you just want to get them harvested and then wait until winter sometime to separate them. And it's not impossible to do that. It just requires planning. And so now I'm going to move into the portion of my talk where I give a few brief examples of my own research. And I'll keep this brief and applied in terms of recommendations, because I know what I'm going for here is giving you information you can use as a farmer or an agronomist. So chickpea flax, why did we do this? The big motivations were managing that foliar disease, Ascochyta, caused by Ascochyta rabii, which is a devastating disease in chickpea that is often managed by many expensive fungicide applications. And then that brings with it the risk of fungicide insensitivity. And then also to expand the area where chickpea can be grown into wetter regions outside of those that are normally insured in Saskatchewan for chickpea production. So between 2018 and 2023, we did small plot field trials where we used two different nitrogen rates, either low, it wasn't really zero because there was some nitrogen in with the phosphorus fertilizer, but low and high. Um, and then different flax seeding rates from nothing all the way up to roughly a monocrop rate in with the chickpea. So we had in that highest seeding rate, we had like a monocrop rate of chickpea and a monocrop rate of flax together. And then we tested two row arrangements, either mixed or alternating rows. And we did this at 5 different sites in Swift Current, where I'm based, which is right in the heart of chickpea growing country, where it tends to be dry. And then Saskatoon, Indian Head, Redvers, and Melfort. Melfort especially is way outside of where chickpea would normally be grown. And normally if you tried to grow chickpea by themselves there, they would freeze as green plants with no seed at the end of the season in October and November. But we wanted to kind of push the system and see what would happen, and also hope to get some wetter years and get more disease. And they were seeded and harvested at the same time within each site. So what did we find? So these results have just recently been published, and so you can find them online in the journal Legume Science with me, Michelle Hubbard, as the first author. And so what we generally found is that disease was overall reduced by intercropping, but that you only saw this in some site years. And so this graph shows on the y-axis where it says peak severity, that's like the time within the season where the disease was the most severe. So a bigger number means more severe disease. And then a lower dot means less severe disease. And then we looked at each different flax seeding rate and found that for some sites and years there was a relationship, either a linear or a quadratic one, where disease tended to be reduced by the addition of more flax, sometimes kind of maxing out at about half. So here where it says 300 seeds per meter squared, that's about half the flax monocrop rate. And that's in some sites and years. That was where there was the lowest disease. Sometimes 600 or monocrop rate of flax was actually the best for reducing disease. And so here, what I'd recommend based on the information we have now is if you're in a wetter area, probably go higher on the flax, but in general, use about a third to a half of the flax monocrop rate and keep your chickpea rate up at, at or close to what you'd use in a monocrop. And then what did we find in terms of row arrangement? We found that most often it made no difference. And so all of these different codes at the bottom here, like IH is Indian Head, MF is Melfort. Most of the time it didn't make a difference in terms of disease, whether we used mixed rows or alternating rows. And occasionally it did, and mixed rows led to a little more disease. But really what I'd recommend as a farmer is do whatever, either one can work. So do what feels easiest or more feasible for your operation and your equipment. And then how did nitrogen impact disease? Overall, adding nitrogen led to more disease, not drastically more, but that makes some sense as it would increase the density of the canopy. And so that if there's more plants there, it typically would be moisture or just more contact between chickpea leaves, letting the disease spread more. So more disease. So the recommendation there would be don't add extra nitrogen if your goal is disease management. And that also has cost saving benefits, of course. And then as some colleagues of mine, Dr. Jeff Shano, who's a professor at the U of S, and a grad student of his, Melanie Reed, found, then chickpea didn't fix more nitrogen when it was in an intercrop, but it did share its nitrogen with the flax. And this could lead to less nitrogen depletion from the flax. And then they also found that there were yield benefits in some of the site years, and that they found sometimes that the yield was better in alternating rows rather than mixed rows, which makes sense if you think about like the competition that in mixed rows the plants are really squished together and competing. However, they in their trial in this paper, they also reduced the seeding rates more when they were in alternating rows. And if that makes sense when you think about that, what we did in my work is we would keep the chickpea seeding rate the same even in alternating rows, and that meant that within the row there was far more chickpeas in my trial compared to this trial. So that's something neither we don't really know which is right or wrong or better in different settings, but it's something to think about. But that despite doing that, despite using fewer seeds overall in this paper, they still got better yield overall by using alternating rows. So if that works for you, and then that could be a way to go. But then alternating rows might be harder to accommodate to figure out how you're going to make that work with your seeder. So in conclusion, chickpea flax is a relatively well-studied system. There's still a lot more research that should be done or more just farmers trying it themselves. And it does work for reducing ascochyta blight, for providing nitrogen to the flax, and sometimes for increasing yield. And either mixed or alternating rows can work. And we also really need more data when the disease pressure is higher. It doesn't eliminate the need for fungicide. I wouldn't recommend just not applying fungicide. You'd still need to keep checking for fungicide and for disease, I should say, in the chickpea and potentially applying fungicide, but perhaps less often and reducing your cost that way. Then another example I'll touch on here is intercropping pea with either brassicas like canola or mustard or with oat. And so really why we were doing this work is to look at root rot and to see if this system could reduce the root rot in the pea. And so the theory, so first here, this map just shows where this was done. It was done really all across the prairies and done over quite a few years. And then the reason, as I mentioned, was to manage root rot. So root rot, as you are likely aware, is a massive problem in peas and lentils and can completely kill crops in the wrong circumstances. If it's wet or you have a field with high disease pressure or a field where peas and lentils have been growing previously and had disease. And it's caused by a range of different pathogens. The most famous one is Aphanomyces eutyches, and that's the one that I have a picture here of an oospore, one of their long-lived resting structures that can remain alive in the soil for a really long time. And then also fusariums, which can of course cause disease in cereals and canola as well, and they can also contribute to root rot. So what we were hoping to see in this trial is that as brassicas break down, they release, I should say, glucosinolates, which are like those hot compounds in mustard or horseradish, and those decompose into isothiocyanates, which can then biofumigate the soils or kill pathogens. So we were hoping that that would happen over the course of the season and lead to reduced root rot, or that by adding oat can produce compounds that also could interfere with pathogens or stimulate the resting spore germination. And then once those resting spores germinate, they're not resting anymore and they can't cause disease in oat. So we were hoping that it would reduce root rot. And this work has also recently been published, so you can look it up in more detail if you're inclined. But really what we found from a farmer's point of view, one very important and disappointing finding is that it never led to less root rot. And that makes sense in the sense that those mechanisms I was talking about happen as the roots break down, and that's not really what's happening in an intercrop. So maybe as a rotation or a green manure, they might be more effective, but um, like in an intercrop, the brassica or the oats are quite small early in the season when the most severe infection could be getting going. So we found no benefit of root rot across all these different sites and years, with some with very severe root rot and some less so. However, we did find in one year where we had some mycosporella blight, which is another name for ascochyta blight in pea, foliar disease, we did find that intercropping helped with that. So that was promising and something that that could be looked into further. And we also found that weeds were decreased in the Manitoba site. Most sites we didn't record the weeds, so we don't know. But in Manitoba, we did find less weeds. So while the results were in some sense very disappointing, in other senses, pea and brassica could still be very well worth doing. We also found a increase in land equivalency ratio or overall yield at some sites, and this is just an example of one of those sites where we actually found LERs or land equivalency ratios that were up around 2 for some combinations. So that's really good. And they weren't, this wasn't necessarily why they were high, but because we found it wasn't just in the severe root rot sites, but you could get very high LERs if your peas all died in your monocrop. And so those yields were very, very low. And then even a few survived in the intercrop. And so in conclusion, unfortunately, You're likely to be disappointed if you set out to grow peas and canola together to reduce root rot, but it is still worth doing for a variety of reasons, including reduced foliar disease, reduced weeds, and increased yield, and potentially for reduced lodging for the pea and oat, like I showed earlier in this talk. And so that brings me to the end of my slides almost, except for my acknowledgements. But I want to reiterate that if you're considering intercropping, remember to think about why you're doing it and what problems or problem are you hoping to address, or what are you hoping to gain from it? And then talk to others who've tried it or who are knowledgeable about it, and consider how you're going to do it. All those practical considerations that I mentioned, like seeding, timing, what herbicides will you use, if any, how will you harvest, how will you separate the seeds, etc. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge the technical support from all the different sites that made all this work possible, and the many organizations that funded my research and made this all possible. And then if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And before we do get into the question and answer portion of your presentation, I just want to, there seem to have been some difficulties with people logging on today, so I apologize for that. But for those of you who did miss the beginning portion of this presentation, it is being recorded, and I will be sending out a recording link to everybody once it's generated and it's ready to be sent out. So if there were some other individuals that didn't get a chance to review this, please share the link with them so that they too can review the presentation as well. So again, I apologize for that inconvenience. But that being said, and again, thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Because at this point in time, what we want to do is take the research that has been presented and see if there's any questions from anybody on the call today. And if there's no questions, or you would even be looking for, sorry, excuse me, does anybody else or anybody on this call as well have any experience with intercropping as well, and some of the things that you've been seeing with that intercropping as well? And I'll turn to you, Jordan, to see if there's any questions, because sometimes people send you questions. Anything from your end at this point in time?
Nothing on today's, nope.
Okay. So if you do have a question, a comment, please raise your hand or just unmute your microphone and please ask your question. Or if you're too shy, you can use the question and answer feature here in Teams. And you can type in your question there. And I do not see anything at this point in time. But Michelle, I guess one of the questions, sorry, my apologies, that I can ask is, how can we as CARE or as an ag industry help with your research? Is there anything that, might be more helpful? Is there some more information that can be provided to help you further along your research?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, by having events like this, that helps in itself to get a bit of awareness out, because sometimes I do research that is survey based, and we as Ag Canada need permission, of course, to access people's land. So if there's more awareness of what we're trying to do, that helps get permission or get people to volunteer, or to get, sometimes what I'm asking for, so often I partner with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture or with other organizations outside of the province to collect samples or information, and it helps kind of raise awareness. And then sometimes I'll also get samples or information from private agronomists, so not necessarily from the farmers, but from an independent or a company agronomist can let me know that one of their clients has an issue that I might be interested in. So, for example, this year, this is not intercropping related, but I'm looking for information about nematodes in soils and chickpea fields in Saskatchewan. And so to have fields where people would be willing to be surveyed. And then in other years, I've done surveys, for example, for anthracnose of lentil or for ascochyta blight, and I will then go back and collect agronomic information from farmers if they're willing to do that. So then one of my staff would contact them and ask things like crop rotation or fungicides, and then we would incorporate that with, of course, being not publicizing anyone's personal information. It would be aggregated across the study, but it helps give information as to whether there's any connection between practices and outcomes, and then that can be useful to farmers to make their own decisions.
Yeah, and that makes sense. The more information you can have from a variety of different sources will just help to substantiate the research that you're doing. So would they just reach out to you directly in email? Is that sort of the best protocol?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Like my email can be found easily by searching my name, Michelle Hubbard, and then my government email can be found.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. So again, I'll ask the question again. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask of Michelle, or again, does anybody themselves have had or seen any, have any experience with the intercropping in what they're doing?
I can make another comment here. So
Please.
like, in order to get funding for future intercropping, it's important to know or to develop my own ideas of what makes sense to work on, to know what people are doing, so that it makes it, I really like to know what are people doing, like what combinations are working. And so then if that's reported to crop insurance, then I can contact them and they can give me data like that table I showed today. And they could also tell me like acres with different combinations. And so then that could help me come up with realistic research questions, like does it make sense to work on lentil and flax? Or does that not, very few people are doing that, so maybe effort would be better spent elsewhere. And so it helps us make better decisions as researchers and come up with something that's actually helpful.
Yeah, no, and that absolutely makes sense. Again, again, the more knowledge you can have in coming into you, then it increases the opportunities for the research. So absolutely. So if there are no other questions or no other comments at this point in time, I'm happy to give people, I guess we got 10 minutes or 12 minutes really back of their day. But again, if there's other questions that you do have, please reach out to Michelle. Actually, here's another question that I have. If there are, a group of retailers or somebody in the industry who wants you to come and relay some information, is that something that you offer as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Like I've gone out and spoken at field days, or I've done like crop walks with people, or I've done another aspect of my work is mystery or chickpea illness of an unknown cause. And so that started by farmers calling either me or another colleague who then told me, and then going out and seeing the issue. So I'm also happy to do that for either that issue or other ones. Like if there's something weird going on that could conceivably tie into a disease of a pulse crop, then I'm happy to come out and do that. Or to entertain I can't guarantee I can accept them, but entertain invitations to speak at winter extension events. I definitely do that.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, again, thank you very much. And again, we at CARE, we just love to support the work that you guys do because it just helps the ag industry as a whole. So again, thank you. And I'm happy that we're able to provide this platform for you to speak. So again, if anybody else has any questions, please reach out to Michelle. But Michelle, I do want to thank you for, again, the presentation. And everybody have a good rest of the day. Thank you
very much.